And now we're on Amud Beis, Chafei Amud Beis. Uraminu. So we have this first brisa with the threefold distinction that we had on Amud Aleph. Now we're going to bring a second brisa that seems to contradict this first brisa. Al ma hatzitz meratz al adam ve'al abosav al achelev shenitma bein b'shogig bein b'mezid bein be'onis bein b'rotzim bein b'yochid bein b'tzibur. Now, the key of keys to understand the contradiction here is the last few words that we just quoted, bein b'yochid, etc. Meaning that even in the case of a korban of a yochid, it matters not whether or not the korban was brought betuma deliberately or inadvertently. It matters not. So it means that there is no knas. Even in the case of a korban yochid, we're not going to impose any sort of knas. And we just finished saying, according to the previous brisa on Amud Aleph, that if the korban yochid was brought betuma deliberately, then we consent and we pass the korban. Amar Rav Yosef lo kasha, ha Rav Yossi ha Rabban. Actually, this issue of whether or not there's a knas, and we're talking about a korban yochid, in a case where the korban was brought betuma, is a matter of debate between Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim. And we're going to see in a minute that according to Rabbi Yossi, it doesn't matter whether he did this b'mezid or b'shogeg. Straight across the board, we have ritzitzitz. According to Rabbanan, on the other hand, we're going to try to prove that the Rabbanan maintain that there is a difference between mezid and shogeg, and in the case of mezid, we're going to impose a penalty called a knas. How do we see that? So now we're going to fast forward to truma, and the halacha is that let's say you have peros here, and you have peros there. The peros here are tmeim. They contaminated lomazogin tumasheretz. You cannot use those peros to be mafresh for the sake of those peros which are tar. And now the question is, what happens if he went ahead and he did it? Do we impose a knas and we completely invalidate the hafresh of the truma? Ein tomim min atomi al atome v'im toram. Now the Mishnah is going, this Bryce, I should say, is going to differentiate between mezid and shogeg. B'shogeg trumasa truma, b'mezid ain't trumasa truma. We're going to impose a penalty. If he knew very well that these fruits were tamei, and he went ahead and he was mafresh, we're going to tell him that his hafrasha is not valid, the truma is not chal. And that is the sheet of the Chachamim, that there's a knas that has to be imposed on someone who knew very well about the status of the state of tumah. And therefore, that sheet of the Chachamim in the brisa of Truma is going to reflect in the brisa that we had before about Kodshim, in which case we said that we're going to differentiate between Mezid and Shogeg. You remember that was the middle category of that brisa that we had in Amud Aleph. Namely, in a case of a korban yachid, it depends whether he knew and deliberately was zorek, and he knew, aware of the fact that it's tameh. However, Rabbi Yossi Omer, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, trumos and truma. Rabbi Yossi never accepted this distinction between mezid and shogeg. And if his truma is valid in the case of a shogeg, then we're going to say it's valid even in the case of a mezid, and we're not going to impose any sort of penalty. There's no knas. Because again, the idea is that Rabbi Yossi doesn't want to impose a knas on someone who's basically, I don't know what to say it. He has his heart in the right place. He wants to be mafresh true. He wants to be zorik the korban and bring ritzi korban. In such a case, according to Rav Yossi, we do not impose a knas. We're not going to invalidate the korban, nor the truma. However, the Rabbanan say no. Let's differentiate between a mezid and a shogeg. And in the case of a mezid, we want to impose a knas. We're going to impose that knas in the case of truma and he went in, he was mafresh truma bituma, we're going to invalidate the truma. In the case where he was zorik the dam of a carbon, knowing full well that it's tummy, we're going to invalidate the carbon. Gemara says, wait a minute. You want to build castles in the sky based on Rav Yossi and Truma. Emer deshamet later Rav Yossi the low kanis. Where do you find that Rav Yossi is interested in his goodwill, so to speak, and therefore there's not going to be a penalty imposed on him? Dimaratze sits al achilos mishametle. Wait a second. There's something else in this brisa that we said, Bain bishogeg, Bain mimezid. There is a ritzitzitz. This brisa also goes on record as saying that the ritzitzitz applies even if there was tumas basar or tumas chelev. Basar that's eaten by the Kohen, and chelev that's burnt on the mizbeach. Forget about zrikas hadam. Zrikas hadam is one of the avodos, and we understand very well that with regard to zrikas hadam, there's going to be a problem in the hechshar carbon, and the tzitz is going to save the day. But now we're talking in this brisa about eating the basar and being maktir the chelev. Well, guess what? In those cases, we don't have such a thing as ritzitzitz. The basar became tamei. That's it. It's out of the ballpark. The avarim became tmeim. The chelev, whatever it is, you can't be maktir. And we're going to prove that now from a brisa that indeed is Rabbi Yossi's shita. That there was no ritzitzitz on the basar or on the chelev. Ritzitzitz is on the carbon itself. So in other words, you want to tell me that this second brisa should be attributed to Rabbi Yossi, but you have a problem because this brisa not only addresses the question of Mazid versus Shogeg and makes that distinction, because this brisa holds that we have to impose a penalty, a knas, in the case of Mazid. And the brisa comes to the conclusion that Bein b'Shogeg, Bein b'Mazid, the carbon is kosher. So now you're going to tell me that this brisa should be attributed to Rabbi Yossi, as if to say that Rabbi Yossi suspends the knas in the case of Mazid, but you have another problem here because the brisa makes another statement and addresses a different point as to whether or not there's ritzitzitz on the basar. And that for sure, Rabbi Yossi holds there is no ritzitzitz on the basar, so it can't be that this brisa is authored by Rabbi Yossi. This brisa goes on record as saying that ritzitzitz is maratz even on the basar. The Sanya we learned in the brisa. Now the brisa records a machlok between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim. Rabbi Eliezer Omer hatzitz meratze al achilos. Rabbi Eliezer is willing to go as far as to say that ritzitzitz is meratze not only to be machshir the carbon, which was brought betuma, but even to be meratze on those parts of the basar that are given to the kohanim to eat if they contracted tumah. Let's say a sheretz fell on the basar. And that's how far the scope or the power of tzitz expands. It's a great arm that expands even for the basar, even for achil. However, Rabbi Yossi Omer ein tzitz marachsan al achilos. Rabbi Yossi makes the distinction between the carbon itself and the achila of the basar or the aktar of the chelev. With regard to the power of tzitz, the power of tzitz, according to Rabbi Yossi, is limited to the carbon itself. It has no bearing on tumas basar or tumas chelev for haktar. So forget about trying to attribute that brisa to Rabbi Yossi. You're stuck between a rock and a hard place because that brisa has ritzitzitz on achilos, and Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion that ain't tzitz maratz al achilos. Epoch. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch around the names. And that which we attributed to Rabbi Eliezer is now going to be Rabbi Yossi and vice versa. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, this is the new formulation of the Brisa called the Epoch. So it's Rabbi Eliezer who says that there's no ritzitzitz on the achila, on the basar, and the chelet. But Rabbi Yossi Omer hatzitz meratz al achilos. The tzitz does have the power to create a ritzui even on that which is eaten or burnt on the mizbeach and contracted tumah. Now, let's just point out, when the Gemara uses epoch, it's usually very desperate, and epoch means to switch around the thing. But even epoch is going to be subject to attack. It's not invincible. And that's what the Gemara is going to do now. Maskif lo Rav Sheshes, umimotzes apchasle. Do you really have the green light to switch around the names here between Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Yossi? Well, guess what? For Tanya, we have a brisa that says, Yachal basar shenitnei zrikas domim, you chayav alav mishum tuma. Well, if a tame eats kodshim, then he's chayav kares. What happens if the basar that he ate from the karba was also tame? So you might say that he should be chayav in this case. He should get kares because he's tame and he's eating the basar which was nitma. It became tame before the zrikas hadam. Now let's try to understand the significance of lifnei zrikas hadam. And this is the part of the sugya. It's a little complicated, but I'll give you what I understand. And it means the following. Zrika is matir. So if the carbon was tahar until the point of zrika, and then after zrika became tameh, contracted tumah, then we'll say that once the zrika was effective and it's matir, you can't undermine that. It cannot be rescinded. But what happens if the basar became tameh before the zrika? That's what we're talking about now. Talmud Lomar called tahar yochal basar. Now we're going to derive from what's called smichus haparshios, because this pasuk, which is referring to the basar of the shlamim, which is eaten by the bailim, is followed immediately by another pasuk that says va'nefesh tochal basar mizevach hashlamim asher Hashem v'timasa olav v'nichrisa. If a person, whether it be a Kohen or a Yisrael, it makes no difference, talking about a shlamim, went ahead in his state of tumah, and he went ahead and he ate the basar of the shlamim, the nichrasa, he gets kares. Now, take a look at the smichus of these two psukim. It says, "Hanefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlamim." It sounds like the Torah is prohibiting or punishing, if you will, he who is tamei and ate from the zevach hashlamim, meaning it was after zrika. Hanita l'tahorim. So it means that the zrika was already implemented, and therefore anyone who's Torah could eat from the shlamim. And therefore, chayovin alev mishum tumah. If he's tamei and he eats shlamim, which is kodesh, then he incurs a chiyuv kares. However, v'she'eno nito l'tahorim. But let's say we have a case where after the zrika, the carbon contracted tumah, then it's not nitar l'tahorim. Tahorim can't eat it even though they're tar, because the basar is tameh. So the first pasuk was called Torah Yochal Basar, And that pasuk really means that the zrika was done at a moment in time when the basar was tar. Again, let's just read it one more time. She'eno nitar l'tahorim, meaning that the zrika, right? The zrika was not implemented as a matir. It couldn't be chal as a matir, and therefore it's not included in the first pasuk of a called tahar. So let's say, for example, the basar became tummy before the zrika. Ein chayov nolem mishum tuma. That's the original, how should I say, svara or opinion of this price. However, there's another twist, another perspective on this smichus hapsukim. Oh, eno, or maybe what it means is elinecha litahorim chayovin oleh mishum tuma. V'she'eno necha litahorim ein chayovin oleh mishum tuma. Which means that if the basar contracted tuma, then there's no chiv karis for a tummy to eat it because it's eno nechal tahorim. The tahorim here are in the same boat as the tummy. Otzi anias halon vesayotze she'en nechal tahorim. Let's say, for example, the zrika was implemented before, bekashrus, and then the carbon was taken out. Yotze means it was taken chutz le'azora. Or lan meaning it stayed overnight. It was supposed to be eaten before nightfall. So again, now the carbon is prohibited to a tar the same way it's prohibited to a tame. And maybe I should say in such a case, it doesn't come under kol tar yochel basar, and therefore the tame eats it, he's not chayiv kares. Talmud lomar, there's a ribui. What's the ribui? Asher lashem riba. So the Torah is including in the chiyuv kares any tame who eats from the carbon, even though the carbon now cannot be eaten by the tahorim. So again, if we only had the pasuk called tar yochal basar, we would say that lon or yotze would not be subject to the iser kares of a tummy who eats it, because it doesn't fit into the pasuk called tar yochal, meaning that's mutter to tahorim, and now it's not mutter to tahorim because it's possible midin yotze or midin lina. But Talmud Lomer, since we have an extra ribui of Asher Lashem ribui to teach us that even a carbon which cannot be eaten by the tahorim, which means that it became possible midin yotze or midin lina, nevertheless, if the Tomei eats it, he's chayiv kares. Yochal shani marbel. Let's go even further and say it's a pigulim es and osaros. This is a little bit strange here because pigulim and osaros are chayiv and kares anyway. So why would I make a big deal about this ribui to tell me that if a tame ate from pigul and nosar, he's chayiv kares b'toras tame? I mean, why would that change anything? He's chayiv kares anyway because it's pigul and nosar. So the Gemara says nosaras hainu lon. Right? What are you asking me? You're asking about nosaros. We already had that in the Brisa. So lon means it stayed overnight and it became nosar. Ella, so take out the word nosar. Ella af hapigulim kinosaros. Talmud lomar mizevach shlomim miet. So now we have a miut, and this is going to be mamait pigul. So pigul is not subject to bonagid an additional iser of tuma if a tame eats the pigul. Umara isel rabas is elu hotzias elu. Right? In the case of lan, that it was overnight, you want to say that what? That it's included in the chiyuv karis of a tummy that eats it even after lina, even though it's possible tahorim. But in the case of pigul, you're going to tell me that if the tummy eats the pigul, he's not chayiv mishum tuma. So Gemara says, "My rois, how do you know to derive it in that direction?" Gemara says, "Achar sheriba kosu v'mir amarta." Right, we have both a riba and a miut. Is marbanias elu shahoisalem shasa kosher, motzinias elu shahoisalem shasa kosher. In the case of Pigel, the machsheves chutz luzmano was at the avoda itself. Let's say at the shas shchita, he had a machshava for chutz luzmano. So that's called lo hoisalo shasa kosher. There was never a moment in which this carbon could be a candidate for a kosher carbon. Not so in the case of Lina. Lina means a perfectly kosher karba, but he left it overnight. The imtomar, and if you'll say, basar shenitma lifnei zrikas damim, v'achol yachar zrikas damim, mipnei machayov nola mishum tuma. Let me ask you a question. In the case where the basar became tummy before zrika, so that was saying is that if he eats betuma, he's tummy, and he eats this basar, he's going to be chayiv kares. But why? The zrika is meaningless. It's already tummy. I mean, at least as we said before, if the moment of zrika, the carbon was tar, so then we etch in stone the matir of zrika. But here, the basar contracted tummy even before the zrika. So how could the tummy be chayiv for eating it? And the answer is because even though the basar contracted tumah before the zrika, nevertheless there's ritzi tzitz. Okay, now we had this whole long brisa. So why do we quote this whole brisa? The answer is nitma in yotze lo. If the basar became tameh before the zrika, then we're saying that if a tameh eats it, he's chayav karetz. But if it was yotze, and that psul yotze was chal even before the zrika, they took it out of the azora. Then lo, we do not say that a tameh who eats it is gonna incur a chiyav kares. So we see clearly that when the basar carbon leaves the confines of the azora and it becomes Pasal midin yotze, and let's add to it that the zrika now is meaningless because he doesn't have a carbon that's roy. And again, the yitzia michutz lazar took place before the zrika, and now we're saying that the zrika is meaningless, and that's justifies the distinction between nitma and yotze. That as far as yotze is concerned, if the psul yotze was chal before the zrika, then the tummy is not chayiv kares. Is man shamet leit yomer ein zrika moelos liyotze? Right? Who is the shita that maintains? Again, this is based on a brisa that we don't know about. The Gemara is going to like allude to this brisa. It's a brisa in Masechta Me'ila. It's going to be Rabbi Eliezer. He's of the opinion that ein zrika moelos liyotze. That if the carbon was yotze, went out of the azor and became possible before the zrika, then the zrika is meaningless. And that's Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, so again, how do we know it's Rabbi Eliezer? For that, we have to learn Masechta Me'ila. The Gemara doesn't reveal it here. Ktani, but yet it says that Maratzit sits al hachilos. We see here that Rabbi Eliezer is maintaining that there is ritziach tzitz on the achilos, right? Because if the zrika is not matir yotze, then how could you go ahead and eat the basar And if a tummy is a basar, he's not chayv kares. It must be the Rabbi Eliezer holds that this ritzui tzitz even for achilos, not just for the carbon, but even for achilos. So Rabbi Eliezer holds that this ritzui tzitz for tuma of those portions that are of the carbon that are normally eaten, and that's against what we tried to suggest when we said epuch, that the brisa, or let's say if we take both brises to contradict each other, basically they reflect the shittas of Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Eliezer, and we wanted to reverse it with epuch. So that means that Rabbi Yossi holds that the tzitz is maratza even for the achilos. Rabbi Eliezer holds that tzitz is not maratza. So it's impossible to say that the brisa that accepts both tzitz in the case of mezin and a shogeg is Rabbi Yossi, because Rabbi Yossi holds that the tzitz is not maratza for tuma with regard to achilos. The brisa, on the other hand, holds that tzitz is maratza for achilos, for the basar. So right now we're stuck with the contradiction between the two brises because we rejected this possibility of epuch. I have an answer. We're going to have about 3 or 4 answers to reconcile the contradictions in the brises. Rabbi Eliezer v'Harabanan. So the second brisa, which says that even in the case of mezid, the tzitz is maratza and there's no imposed penalty, that's Rabbi Eliezer. But Rabbanan, in the first brisa, that maintain that there is a penalty on someone who was deliberate b'mezid, that's Chachamim. Of course, not sure about this. Eimer d'shamet leili Rabbi Eliezer d'maratzit tzitz al achilos. What does Rabbi Eliezer mean when he says his ritzit tzitz? On achilos. But the lokonis mi shametle, how can you go a step further and say that even in the case where he deliberately did this, that there's no knas? What's the basis for that? And then you want to attribute the second brisa to Rabbi Lazar. Well, how do you know that? How do you have any clue that Rabbi Lazar would maintain that the ritzit tzitz is going to impact even in the case of mezid, and we're going to suspend any penalty? The Gemara says there is a logic here that pushes us to that conclusion. Ki hechi de shamet leil Rabbi Yossi, shamet leil Rabbi Eliezer. To the same extent that you heard that Rabbi Yossi would not penalize someone who is deliberate, so too we heard the same thing about Rabbi Eliezer. Tisanya, where do we find a proof that Rabbi Eliezer holds that there's no knas? That's from this brisa that says Rabbi Eliezer Omer Bein B'Shogeg Bein B'Mezid Trumaso Truma. Right, he went ahead and he was mafresh truma from Tomei ala Tahar, and Rabbi Eliezer says that b'diavad if he did so, the truma is chal, and it doesn't even matter if he did it b'mezid. So we demonstrate that Rabbi Eliezer, like Rabbi Yossi, does not accept a knas in the case of a mezid. And therefore, the second brisa that equates mezid and shogeg, and there is ritzui, that could be attributed to Rabbi Yossi. So the Gemara rejects it and says, okay, Rabbi Eliezer suspends the knas in the case of mezid for something that's an avera kala, truma. But now we're talking about kodshim. In the case of kodshim, then how do we know that Rabbi Eliezer would go that far and apply that kula, that leniency? The Gemara says no. the proof is reliable. Why? Imkain, if you're going to tell me that Rabbi Eliezer differentiates between Truma and Kachim, Ha'aman Tarmei, to whom are you going to attribute this brisa that states that the tzitz is maratza even for a person who acted deliberately? We're not aware of any other Tana who did not penalize, and therefore, by possible elimination, we have to rightfully assume that Rabbi Eliezer is the one who accepts this principle that there's no knas in Mezid, both in regard to Truma and in regard to Kodshik. And now we could say the following. The first brisa, which holds that the tzitz is not effective acceptance for an individual acted deliberately, that's the opinion of the Rabbana. They penalize an individual and so forth. The second brisa that maintains that the tzitz will always affect ritzui without any distinction between whether he was mazid or he was shogig. That's going to reflect the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who held that the tzitz is maratza even for achilos. And since he's makil with regard to tzitz being ratzon achilos, he would also be makil to suspend the knas in a case of a mazid. That's one solution. Rafino Amar, I want to suggest another solution to Ma'aso. Bein b'shogig bein b'mezid hurtza. Zrikasa b'shogig hurtza b'mezid lo hurtza. Maybe we should differentiate between two situations. With regard to Zrika, then we have to be more machmir. Zrika is the essence of the ritzui, and if he deliberately took the dam, knowing full well that it's Tomei, and he went ahead and he was Zorik it, then we have to come down hard on him. Don't mess with Zrika. And Rav Shilo is going to say the exact opposite. Zrikaso maybe Bezid Hurza. Again, remember I said before that maybe we could justify, so to speak, why he did this, and b'mezid he did his Zrika with Tomei, because he's so involved in and eager to achieve the kapara and the reach of the carbon that he did it b'tuma. Is pain b'mezid b'shogig hurtza the ritzu yischal. And now the Gemara is going to go on a tirade against Rav Shila. Well, Rav Shila, Tani, what are we going to do with the brisa that says that nitma bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid? How can it be, asks the Gemara, that when it comes to Zrika, I mean, after all, the brisa mentioned even the case of Basar Achelef that became Tomei. So don't tell me that this is a special kula with regard to the Zrika. I mean, we're not even talking about the Zrika, we're talking about the meat of the carbon contracted tumor. So that the Gemara says is no problem. Why Hochikomer? What the Brisa is saying is that Nitma Shogeg, Uzrako Ben B'Shogeg Ben B'Mezid. Oh, but we have a slug up on Rav Shilo Toshma. We're now on the top of Daf Chavav. We want to get to the Mishnah if we can. Is Dam Shenitma Uzrako? If the Dam contracted tumor, and then he went ahead and he threw it on the Mizbeach. B'shogeg hurtza b'mezid lo hurtza. So you see that we do impose a knas in the case of Mezid when he knew very, very well that the dam had contracted too many. He went ahead and he was zorik the dam. This brisa is going to say that if the zrika was done with full knowledge that the dam was tamei, that contradicts Rab Shila, because Rab Shila says that in the case of Zrika, we should differentiate between Mezid and Shogeg, and a Zrika that was done by Mezid. Nevertheless, even though he knows fully well that the Dam is Tameh, it's still valid. And the Gemara says, Hachi Kamar, Dam shenitma uzroko bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid is nitma b'shogeg hurtza b'mezid lo hurtza. This is exactly Rav Shilo. Okay, then. So this is where we'll stop here. So, Mr. Shem, tomorrow we meet at 9:30. Okay, so we'll start the Mishnah here on Chaf. Have a great day.